Hello to everyone. Please give me a moment to share the presentation with you. Here it is. My paper is dedicated to the contemporary perception of heroic period of architecture of former USSR, when the built environment was interpreted as a tool of the transformation of the society according to strong ideological program. It is based on the examples situated in contemporary confines of Russia and treats local specific condition, while each other country of former Soviet Union needs an individual approach. All over the world, the architectural heritage of that period meets a series of problems concerning its perception, interpretation, and conservation. Of course, all these aspects are interconnected. The areas built in 1920s and 1930s in a lot of European countries raised after First World War during the post-war reconstruction and housing crisis. For that reason, they often have monumental character to celebrate the peace and represent the response to the lack of affordable apartments in the times of social tension all over the continent. In some countries, these buildings have political color, not always negative, that is still recognizable. However, the political orientation of the commissioner not always defines the perception of the realized buildings. Socialist subtext of Vienna's Hofs or Berlin's Siedlungs do not provoke negative associations. At the same time, the cases of German architectural heritage realized under Hitler's regime and Mussolini's Italy still provoke controversial reaction when the examples of philological approach to restoration exist, a trend of neglecting that coexist with evident nationalist revisionism positions. In the case of Russia, while the architecture of 20s, defined as avant-garde, has been for decades a subject of studies and professional reflection, it is not the same for the successive period signed with the critical heritage assimilation program, still perceived as a fruit and symbol of Stalin's dictatorship. Russian and Soviet avant-garde moved in the sphere of art history still in 1950s and 1960s. First in the West, for example, the books by Camilla Gray and Vittorio De Feo, and in the USSR in the works by Victoria Khazanova published in 1963, 10 years after Stalin's death. In the same time, in Italy, the rediscovery of interwar artistic and architectural heritage started after long year damnatio due to its relation to fascism. The rationalist movement became to make part of history of modern architecture, while the neoclassical trend was treated as a reactionist. While the work by Giuseppe Terrani became iconic still in early 60s, mostly thanks to Bruno Zevi publications, the first monograph on Marcello Piacentini, the so-called architect of Mussolini, appeared only in 1991. In Russia, the social acceptance of the 1930s, 1950s history, the most difficult and cruel period of country's history in 20th century, has been controversial, and still it is. The ambivalence between the idea of great past, of people's sacrifice for the construction of just society, and then of the struggle against Nazi fascism, and the time of the strongest state terror ever happened in Russian modern history, is still actual. This ambivalence reflects on the perception of buildings and city ensembles created in that period. From the one hand, it can be defined as difficult heritage, so according to Sharon MacDonald, it refers to historically significant past, which is difficult to reconcile to a positive, self-affirming contemporary identity. From the other hand, the buildings of 30s and 50s are present in nearly every city of former USSR. They form the quarters of historical cities and centers of cities of new foundation, or those reconstructed after the Second World War destructions. The capital itself, Moscow, has numerous examples of such heritage, which sometimes play a strong role in its identity. For example, Moscow Metro or Prospect Mira or Leninsky Prospect Ensembles. They represent the idea of city beautiful, using the term of Peter Hall's Cities of Tomorrow, and often are positively perceived by the society for their decorative and monumental qualities that are considered missing in the constructivist buildings of 20s and mass construction of 60s and 70s. However, that is not valid for 30s and 50s historiography. After the famous decree on excesses in architecture issued a few months before the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union that condemned the cult of Stalin, moved to the Stalin's architecture in the periphery of historical research on Russian modern architecture in USSR and in the West. It has been mostly presented as an example of art under dictatorship. While assimilation of heritage examples were already illustrated in the histories of 20th century architecture by Bruno Zevi and those of Manfredo Tafuri and Francesco Dalcò, with critical notes on their connection to the totalitarian ideology in the motherland, the neo-traditionalism was hardly studied by professionals and mostly appeared in the architects' biographies, for example, and those published by Stroy Izdat in 70s and 80s, and as a part of their professional life. The famous Khanmagomedov's Architectura Sovetskого Avantgarde, published in 1997, explains the path to the architecture of classical inspiration as a natural evolution of some architects that was supported by the state administration and even recognizes its crisis already in late 1930s. Among the first attempts of rethinking of Soviet interwar heritage in the paradigm of history of culture was the famous book Kultura 2, Culture 2, by Russian emigre architect and historian Vladimir Paperny, published in Russia in 1997, rather 20 years after it was written by the author. It applied the Heinrich Wölfflin concept of double-phase development of arts to the interwar Soviet art and architecture. He recognized the Culture 1, the period of avant-garde and spreading, and the Culture 2, solidification. Non-trivial analysis by Paperny put the beginning to the slow and complicated process of professional recognition of the so-called Stalin's architecture that was neglected mostly for its ideological aura. Only in 2006, the Academy of Architecture promoted the conference Stalinsky Empire, or Stalin's Empire style, promoted by the most prominent researchers on 20th century architecture, such as mentioned Selim Khanmagomedov, Yulia Kosenkova, and Alexander Rapoport. The proceedings were published with the more moderate title, The Architecture of the Epoch of Stalin's Rule, published in 2010. The book, for its nature, presents a variety of views and does not offer a uniform methodological approach. There is also a trend of interpretation of the history of Soviet heritage of 30s and 50s as a mere realization of Stalin's ambitions and tastes. Among contemporary scholars, it is promoted in the studies by Dmitry Khmelnytsky. He denies that post-1932 architecture of USSR had artistic quality, but does not point on questions of its preservation. The same approach is in the basis of his biographies on Zholtovsky and Shushev, published recently in 2015 and 2019. However, the studies on other non-Soviet cases of collaboration of architects with power can suggest new ways of view. For example, the Piacentini's biography published in 2018 by Italian historian of architecture Paolo Nicoloso that shows how the architect of Mussolini managed to use powerful protectors of every political color for his own ambitions that permitted him to control the Italian architectural scene for more than 50 years, from liberal monarchy through the fascism and Vatican till the Republic. Recently appeared studies in Russia on international contacts of Soviet architects and on foreign architects in the construction of USSR, for example, those by Evgenia Konasheva, as well as detailed studies on architects' biographies, those on Boris Iofan by Maria Kostyuk, single buildings as those by Elena Ovsyannikova, and problematics, Yulia Kosinkova and Mark Mingerson, could open new perspective on the consideration of the place of Soviet heritage in world-built environment history. Nowadays, considerable part of studies on 30s architecture mostly tries to explain its value by insisting on survived avant-garde trends or on its analog to European and American Art Deco. Such are the books by Alexandra Selivanova, among them Postconstructivism, issued in 2018, that uses the term first proposed by Selim Khan Magomedov, or those by Danilo Udavitsky-Selbst, Soviet architectural avant-gardes, architecture in Stalin's revolution from above. It tries, I quote, to bring to light important examples that can support the claim of a strong presence of modern architecture under Stalin's perestroika, as he called it. Despite the evident role that the 30s and 50s buildings have in the living environment of Russian cities, they are still hardly considered as a cultural heritage. The first example of restoration of constructivist buildings appeared still in 2000, but only just finished Narkomfin housing can be called to use scientific approach. In addition to the refurbishment of the building that restored some spaces, even original, in some spaces, even original colors, the architectural team of Ginsburg architects promoted also a series of publications on Monsieur Ginsburg and new editions and translations of architects' writings. What is about assimilation of heritage architecture? It is possible to find some examples of their scientific or presented like that restoration only since 2010. The Gorky Park with its monumental entrance and the VDNH complex in Moscow are most evident examples of that trend. Even a great research on original designs and projects was done. Anyway, it is difficult to call that cases as scientific restoration because the original forms were reproduced in new materials. It is also remarkable that the ideological content of the exhibition is overstepped. The ensemble was built from its uncomfortable past. Anyway, we cannot state a widespread rise of the attention to Stalin's architecture as a sign of particular ambitions of the state policy. In Moscow, the restoration cases are often connected to the renovation of city infrastructure, which follows most of all financial interests. In other cities, these buildings, as usual, are treated with regular maintenance or even considered as old, outdated constructions. A symptomatic example is the case of opera theater in Voronezh, realized in 50s in critical heritage assimilation style, and now under risk of demolition to be replaced by the new, bigger and more up-to-date building of controversial aesthetic qualities. Of course, we mentioned only selected studies on the argument and point out those dedicated to those dedicated to 30s and 50s period as much more undefined. Summarizing, we should affirm that the Soviet architectural heritage of 20s and 50s still provoke the considerations that go beyond the history of architecture, despite it was realized quite a century ago. As Lavronskaya says, its history conflates aesthetic and political discourses and is rooted in Cold War ideology. And she emphasizes that such a view fails to adequately represent the complexity of cultural development in inter-war Russia. The bipolar scheme of good free avant-garde 20s and bad totalitarian repressed 30s and 50s seems to play out, and the history of whole period is seen as much more complicated with its specifics in the war and post-war segments. Despite that, the term Stalin's architecture is still in use. There is still no scholar's consent on its definition, as well as the conservation methodology is very weak. Still, a lot of aspects should be explored. Maybe one of the most important is the international relations of Soviet architects, testified by archive materials, but still insufficiently employed by the scholars. The archives conserve lots of still unexplored testimonies of that difficult and cruel period and can permit to find the tools to impartial analysis and to appreciate its built heritage, not only as a material memory, but also as a fruit of professionals' reflection and reaction. Thank you.